The glass in my hand was still shaking when the shouting started, and I remember thinking, in that first frozen second, that I had made a terrible mistake by ever agreeing to this posting. My name is Veya Ilsenne, and I am a senior negotiator for the Ithran Accord, assigned to Concord Station, the largest neutral meeting ground in this quadrant of settled space. I have spent 11 years learning how to read a room before it turns dangerous. I have talked down border disputes between species who consider eye contact a declaration of war. I have sat across tables from men and women whose entire culture is built around not showing weakness, and I have always known when the air in a room was about to change. I did not see this coming. It started with a raised voice from the Talvex delegation, 3 tables away, and within 4 seconds it had become 5 people on their feet, hands moving toward hidden weapons that were not supposed to be inside a diplomatic hall, and a security alarm beginning its slow rising whine somewhere in the ceiling. I remember the exact moment I understood we were no longer safe, because it was the same moment I turned to find my bodyguard. He was not where I expected him to be. Ethan Cole had been standing quietly against the wall behind my chair for the entire dinner, so still and so unremarkable that I had genuinely forgotten he was there, the way you forget about a coat rack. He was a human, tall in the way most humans are tall, with short brown hair and the kind of face that did not give away much of anything. He had been assigned to me 2 weeks earlier as part of a new security exchange program between the Ithran Accord and the human systems, and if I am honest, I had barely spoken to him beyond the required greetings. I did not think I needed to. He was, in my mind, a formality, a courtesy, a young species trying to prove it belonged at the grown-up table by handing out soldiers like party favors. But when I turned to find him, he was already moving. He did not run toward the exit. He did not shout for help. He crossed the space between us and the nearest threat in a way that did not look fast so much as it looked inevitable, like watching a wave reach the shore, and by the time my mind had caught up with what was happening, the weapon that had been drawn against the Talvex ambassador's rival was no longer in anyone's hand, and the man holding it was on the floor, and Ethan Cole was standing over him with an expression on his face that I can only describe as mildly patient, like he was waiting for a door to open. The whole thing had taken perhaps 3 seconds. The room did not erupt into celebration. It did the opposite. Every delegate in that hall, from 6 different species, went completely silent and stayed silent, staring at the human standing calmly amid the wreckage of overturned chairs, as if they had just watched something that did not belong in a room full of diplomats. I stood there with my glass still in my hand, and I realized I was staring too. Security arrived a full 20 seconds later, which on a station like this is an eternity, and by then Ethan had already restrained the man on the ground, checked him for further weapons, and turned to scan the crowd for any additional threats, all without once raising his voice or his heart rate, as far as I could tell. When the station security officer, a broad-shouldered Grovain named Desacor, finally reached us, she looked at Ethan the way you might look at a piece of machinery that had done something you did not know machinery could do. "How," she said slowly, "did you get here that fast?" Ethan shrugged, an oddly human gesture that somehow made the moment feel even stranger. "Wasn't that fast," he said. "Just didn't hesitate." Dessa did not seem to have a response to that. Neither did I. The rest of the evening dissolved into the usual chaos that follows any incident on a station like this. Statements were taken. The man who had drawn the weapon was escorted away, still looking faintly confused about how he had ended up on the floor. The Talvex ambassador apologized to me 7 separate times, each apology longer and more elaborate than the last, as if volume of words could undo what had almost happened. I accepted each apology with the practiced grace my job requires, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was on the man standing quietly by the door, waiting for me, as if nothing at all had happened. I did not sleep well that night. This is not something I say lightly, because Ithrans require very little sleep to begin with, only a handful of hours cycled through a light rest state, and even that small amount usually comes easily to me. But I lay in my quarters replaying those 3 seconds over and over, trying to understand what I had seen. It was not the speed that unsettled me, not exactly. I have seen fast reflexes before. Several species in the Accord are naturally quicker than humans in raw terms, quicker in ways that would make Ethan Cole look sluggish by comparison on a pure numbers basis. It was not the outcome either, because the threat had been ended without serious injury, which by any reasonable measure was the best possible result. It was the absence of hesitation. Every being I have ever known, myself included, carries some fraction of a second of doubt before committing to violence, even necessary violence, even violence in self-defense. It is that fraction of a second where the mind asks whether there is another way, whether this is truly required, whether the cost will be worth it. I have built my entire career around exploiting that fraction of a second in negotiations, because it is where reason lives, where compromise becomes possible. Ethan Cole had shown none of it, not a flicker, not a pause. He had moved the way water moves downhill, as if there had never been a question in the first place. I told myself it meant nothing. Perhaps he had simply trained extensively. Perhaps humans, being a young species eager to prove themselves on the galactic stage, pushed their soldiers through some brutal program designed to erase hesitation entirely. It was a reasonable theory, and it let me fall asleep eventually, though not comfortably. I did not yet understand that I was asking the wrong question. The morning after the incident, I requested a formal debrief with station security, partly because protocol demanded it, and partly because I wanted an excuse to watch the security footage again. I told myself it was professional diligence. I do not think that was entirely true. This Sakor met me in a small briefing room with grey walls and a table too large for the two of us, and she looked like she had not slept either. "I've reviewed the footage 11 times, she said, before I had even finished sitting down. I keep counting the frames. And, she turned her screen toward me. The footage was slowed to a crawl, each second stretched into 10, and even at that speed, watching Ethan Cole cross the room felt like watching something that had skipped several intermediate steps that everyone else needed. There was no wind-up, no visible decision point. One frame he was standing at the wall, and a handful of frames later he was already in motion, body angled with an efficiency that looked almost mathematical, as if he had solved the entire problem before his legs had even finished responding to the solution. "He wasn't reacting to the weapon," Dessa said quietly. "Watch his eyes. He was already moving before the weapon was fully drawn. He reacted to the intention, not the object. I did not have anything to say to that." I pulled his file, she continued, sliding a datapad across the table toward me. Standard exchange program paperwork, physical evaluations, service history, medical baseline. It's mostly redacted, which is normal for military personnel on assignment, but the baseline numbers that aren't redacted are. She paused, searching for the word. "They're strange." I looked down at the pad. Most of it meant little to me at a glance. Columns of human physiological data I had no context for, resting heart rate, reaction time benchmarks, bone density measurements, immune response markers. What caught my attention was a small notation near the bottom, added by whoever had processed his transfer paperwork, clearly meant as an internal note rather than something intended for outside eyes. Homeworld classification, restricted, cross-reference Sol 3 environmental hazard rating on file with Colonial Survey Office. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Environmental hazard rating." Dessa shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I've never seen that field populated for a species that's already a full Accord member. Every other founding world has a standard habitability designation. Green, yellow, occasionally orange for something with heavy weather or thin atmosphere." She tapped the screen. "I've never seen restricted." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something uncomfortable settle into my chest, a feeling I did not have a name for yet, though I would come to know it very well over the following days. "I want to look into it," I said. Dessa gave me a look that was somewhere between sympathy and warning. "Ambassador, with respect, it might be better left alone. Humans are sensitive about some of their history. It's not exactly a secret that Earth had a rough road before they made it off the planet. Maybe that's all this is. Old records nobody bothered to update. Maybe," I agreed, though I did not believe it, not even a little. I spent the rest of that day in meetings I barely remember, my mind circling back again and again, to that single word on the datapad. Restricted, not because it was forbidden knowledge exactly, but because someone, somewhere, in the vast bureaucracy of interstellar record-keeping, had decided that the truth about humanity's homeworld was not something to be casually filed alongside every other founding species. That evening, Ethan escorted me back to my quarters, as he did every evening, walking 2 steps behind and to my left, silent as always, scanning corridors that had never once shown any sign of danger. I found myself studying him as we walked, the easy set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved constantly without ever seeming anxious, the strange stillness that sat underneath everything he did, like a held breath that never needed to be released. "Can I ask you something?" I said, breaking the silence that had defined our entire working relationship so far. He glanced at me, mildly curious. "Sure. Last night, when you moved, did it feel fast to you?" He considered the question with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything. "Didn't really feel like anything," he said eventually. "Just the thing that needed doing. It didn't feel dangerous." He almost smiled at that, a small, private expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am, no offense, but that wasn't dangerous." I stopped walking. He stopped too, a respectful distance away, waiting. "What would you consider dangerous?" I asked. For the first time since I had met him, Ethan Cole seemed to actually think before answering, as if the question required him to reach back into some part of himself he did not usually visit while on duty. "Depends where you're standing," he said finally. "Where I grew up, dangerous means something a little different than it might mean here." "And where did you grow up?" He met my eyes then, and there was nothing dramatic in his expression, nothing meant to unsettle me, just a simple, quiet honesty that somehow unsettled me far more than theatrics ever could have. "Earth," he said, "ma'am." He said it the way someone might state their favorite color, or the weather outside. A plain fact, offered without weight, without pride, without apology. But something in the way he said it, some small note underneath the words, told me that the word Earth carried a meaning for him that it did not carry for me, and that whatever that meaning was, it explained everything I had watched happen the night before, the absence of hesitation, the strange stillness, the way 3 seconds of violence had rolled off him like it was nothing at all. I did not sleep again that night, and this time I did not pretend to myself that it was about protocol or professional diligence. I lay awake turning over that single word, restricted, and that single sentence, "Earth, ma'am," and I understood, somewhere in the deep quiet hours before my body's rest cycle finally pulled me under, that I had been living beside something for 2 weeks that I did not yet understand at all. I did not know it then, but I was about to learn exactly what that word meant, and once I did, I would never look at humanity, or at the quiet man who stood outside my door every night, the same way again. The request I filed the next morning with the Colonial Survey Office was simple enough on paper. I asked for the full environmental classification record on file for Sol 3, the world humans called Earth, citing my role as lead negotiator on the Human Exchange Program as justification. It should have been a routine request, the kind processed and returned within a single work cycle. It took 4 days, and when the file finally arrived, it came with a message from the archivist attached, short and oddly personal for an official communication. "Ambassador, this file rarely gets requested outside of Colonial Survey internal use. I would recommend reading it somewhere quiet." I did not understand the warning until I opened the file myself, alone in my quarters, with Ethan standing his usual patient watch outside my door, utterly unaware that I was, for the first time, about to learn exactly what kind of world had made him. The file was long, longer than I expected for a single planetary classification, and it took me most of the evening to read through it properly. I want to be honest about something before I describe what I found. I have read hundreds of environmental survey reports over the course of my career. Most worlds fall into predictable patterns, gentle variations on a handful of familiar themes. A little more radiation here, a little less breathable atmosphere there, perhaps a native predator species that requires caution during colonization. I expected Earth's file to be more of the same, dressed up in whatever dramatic language had earned it the restricted label. I was not prepared for what I actually found. The survey opened with a standard habitability overview, and even that first section made me sit up straighter in my chair. Earth's gravity sits notably higher than what most Accord member species consider comfortable, a detail that on its own explained a great deal about human musculature and bone density, numbers I had glanced at without understanding on that datapad days earlier. But gravity was the smallest and least alarming entry on the list. The atmosphere itself, the survey noted, carried an oxygen concentration high enough to be actively hazardous to several known species, a concentration that made fire itself burn faster and hotter than on almost any other inhabited world in the Accord. I had never considered fire as a variable that could differ between planets. I do now. Then came the section on native life, and this is where I began to understand why the archivist had recommended I read this somewhere quiet. Earth's biosphere, according to the survey, is one of the most densely competitive ecosystems ever catalogued. Nearly every level of that ecosystem, from the smallest organisms to the largest, exists in a state of constant pressure, constant competition, constant adaptation against threats that never stop evolving alongside them. The survey used a phrase that stayed with me long after I closed the file. It described Earth's evolutionary history as an unbroken chain of extinction-level pressure lasting hundreds of millions of years, a planet where nothing survives by accident, because nothing on it is permitted to relax. There were passages about native predator species so numerous that the survey did not attempt to list them individually, instead grouping them into broad categories by threat profile. There were passages about microscopic threats, an entire section devoted to the sheer density and aggression of Earth's disease-causing organisms, describing an immune system arms race that had been running for as long as complex life had existed on the planet. There was a note, almost an aside, mentioning that humans carry immune systems calibrated against a volume and variety of pathogens that would overwhelm most other known species within days of exposure, and that humans themselves had spent their entire evolutionary history building resistance to threats that simply do not exist anywhere else in known space. There was a section on weather. I had never considered weather a survival threat before reading that file. The survey described storms capable of leveling settlements, temperature extremes spanning a range wider than almost any other inhabited world, entire regions of the planet that remained functionally hostile to unprotected life even after tens of thousands of years of human habitation. And then, near the end, there was a short historical summary written in the dry, careful language of a scientific document that somehow managed to convey more weight than anything else in the file. It noted that humanity had achieved technological civilization and eventually spaceflight, while still sharing their homeworld with a full ecosystem of active natural threats that most other spacefaring species had never faced at all, or had faced only in early, primitive stages of their development, long before civilization existed to record it. Other species reached the stars after leaving their dangers behind. Humans reached the stars while their dangers were still very much present, still actively trying to end them, every single day, for the entire span of their recorded history. The survey's final classification line was simple enough that I read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Sol 3 Environmental Hazard Rating, Extreme, Cross-Reference Designation, colloquial term in wide informal use among colonial survey field staff, Deathworld. I set the datapad down on the table in front of me and sat very still for a long time. Deathworld. I turned the word over in my mind, trying to understand the full weight of it, trying to reconcile it with the quiet, patient man standing outside my door, the one who had shrugged off a violent incident as if it were nothing, who had described his own reflexes as simply the thing that needed doing. I thought about his answer from 2 nights before. Depends where you're standing. Where I grew up, dangerous means something a little different than it might mean here. I had thought, at the time, that he was being modest, or perhaps deflecting a question he did not want to answer fully. I understood now that he had been giving me the truth, plainly and without exaggeration, and that I simply had not possessed the context to understand what he meant. Everything I had witnessed in that dining hall, the absence of hesitation, the eerie economy of motion, the calm that had followed rather than any visible relief, None of it had been the product of extraordinary training or unusual discipline, or at least, not only that. It had been the ordinary baseline behavior of a species that had spent its entire existence being tested by a homeworld that offered no mercy and asked no permission before trying to end them. I found myself thinking about something an instructor had told me many years ago during my earliest training as a negotiator. She had said that the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one who raises their voice first. It is the one who has already decided, calmly and completely, exactly what they will do if a threat becomes real, and who no longer needs to spend any time deciding once that moment arrives. I had spent 2 weeks standing beside a man who had already made that decision every single day of his life, before he had ever set foot on this station, before he had ever met me, before humanity had ever left its own solar system. I did not sleep that night either. I do not think I could have, even if I had wanted to. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Ethan before our scheduled duties began, and he arrived at my door precisely on time, as he always did, with the same easy stillness he carried into every room. I had rehearsed several ways to begin the conversation, careful diplomatic phrasings meant to approach a sensitive topic gently, the way I would with almost any other species discussing difficult history. In the end, I simply told him what I had read. He listened without interrupting, standing near the window of my quarters, with his hands loosely at his sides, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the slow turn of stars beyond the reinforced glass. "Yeah," he said eventually, "that's about right." "That's about right," I repeated. "Ethan, the report described your entire planet as an active threat to its own population. It used the word extreme. It used the word Deathworld." He turned back toward me, and there was something in his expression that I had not seen from him before, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it, a kind of weary familiarity, as if this was a conversation he had been through many times before, with many different people from many different worlds. "It's not wrong," he said simply. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you Earth is some peaceful garden world that got a bad write-up. It isn't. Where I grew up, you learn early that the world doesn't owe you a warning before something tries to kill you. Weather does it. Animals do it. Sometimes just plain bad luck does it. You grow up around that. You either adapt or you don't make it to adulthood at all. And everyone simply accepts this. Not much choice," he said, with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "It's not really a decision, Ambassador. It's just where we're from." I studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the calm, quiet man standing in front of me with everything I had read the night before, and finding, to my surprise, that the two pictures were not in conflict at all. They were the same picture. I simply had not had the context to see it clearly until now. "The incident in the dining hall," I said slowly. "You said it wasn't dangerous." "It wasn't," he said, and there was no bravado in the way he said it, no attempt to impress me. It was simply a fact, stated plainly. One person, one weapon, in a room full of people who could see him coming. Compared to some of the things I grew up around, that's about as low risk as a situation gets. I did not know what to say to that. I am not sure there was anything to say. "I want you to understand something," I told him finally, because I do not think I understood it myself until last night. When the Ithran Accord agreed to this exchange program, I do not believe any of us truly understood what we were asking humanity to bring into our worlds. We thought we were receiving soldiers. I am beginning to suspect we received something considerably more than that. Ethan did not respond to that directly. He simply nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement, and said, "We don't really think of it that way. Back home, it's just Tuesday." I laughed despite myself, a short, surprised sound, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something like genuine warmth cross his face in response. But underneath that small moment of levity, something had shifted in me permanently, and I do not think it ever shifted back. I had spent my entire career learning to read the danger in a room before it became visible to anyone else. I had prided myself on that skill. I had built an entire professional identity around the idea that I understood risk better than most beings I encountered. I understood now that I had been standing beside the single greatest risk assessment failure of my career for 2 full weeks, and that failure had a name and a quiet voice, and had been standing patiently outside my door every single night, waiting to walk me safely home. I did not yet know that within the week I would watch him prove every word of that survey report correct, in front of an entire council chamber, in a moment that would leave every delegate present, myself included, in complete and total silence. In the days that followed my conversation with Ethan, I found myself doing something I had never done in 11 years of diplomatic work. I started paying attention to a person instead of a position. I stopped seeing him as a formality attached to my security detail and started actually watching him, the way you might watch a piece of music you had heard 100 times before finally hearing the melody underneath it for the first time. Once I started looking, I could not stop seeing it everywhere. There was a maintenance drill on the station 3 days after our conversation, a routine simulated hull breach used to test emergency response times across all sections. The alarm that accompanies these drills is, by design, loud and unpleasant, meant to provoke exactly the kind of urgency required in a real emergency. I have been through a dozen of these drills over the years, and every single time, my body responds the way any reasonable body should respond to a screaming alarm and flashing warning lights, with a spike of adrenaline, a tightening in the chest, a brief animal certainty that something terrible is happening. I watched Ethan during that drill. He moved efficiently to the designated safety point, exactly as protocol required, checked that I was secure, confirmed the nearest emergency exit, and then stood quietly waiting for the all clear, his heart rate, as far as I could tell from simply looking at him, never rising at all. When the drill ended and the alarm cut off, he looked almost faintly bored, the way a person looks when a meeting runs long over something they already knew the answer to. I asked him about it afterward, and he told me, without any particular emotion attached to the words, that a simulated alarm, followed by a controlled evacuation, with clearly marked exits, and trained staff standing by, was, by his own internal measure, close to the safest possible version of an emergency a person could experience. He said it the way someone might describe a mild inconvenience, a delayed train, a minor scheduling conflict. There was another incident, smaller, almost silly in retrospect, that I still think about often. A minor gravity fluctuation occurred one night on the station, the kind of small technical hiccup that happens perhaps once a year and resolves itself within minutes, accompanied by a low warning tone that most residents learn to sleep through after their first few months aboard. I woke immediately, as I always do, alert and slightly unsettled the way anyone reasonably would be. When I checked the corridor camera feed outside my door, out of habit, more from curiosity than genuine concern, I saw Ethan standing his usual post, and he had not moved at all. He was awake, alert, clearly aware the alarm had sounded, but entirely unbothered by it, the way a person might acknowledge a passing sound outside a window without ever fully waking from a comfortable rest. I began to understand, slowly, and with a growing sense of something between awe and quiet unease, that what I was witnessing was not restraint, it was not discipline layered over fear, the way I might have expected from a highly trained soldier suppressing a natural instinct. It was something more fundamental than that. His baseline understanding of what counted as dangerous sat at a threshold so much higher than mine, higher than almost anyone else's on this station, that the events which would send my own heart racing simply did not register to him as anything worth the energy of concern. I found myself wondering what it must be like to move through the galaxy with that kind of internal calibration, whether it was a comfort or a burden, whether humans like Ethan ever felt truly at ease anywhere, or whether the constant, quiet vigilance I had witnessed was simply the only mode he knew how to exist in, even in places that offered him no reason for it at all. I decided to ask him directly, one evening as we walked the long observation corridor back toward my quarters, the stars sliding slowly past the reinforced glass beside us. "Do you ever relax?" I asked. "Truly relax, not simply appear calm, actually feel safe?" He considered the question for a long moment, the way he seemed to consider most things that mattered, unhurried and careful. "Here, on this station," he said finally, "more than most places I've been. It's clean, it's controlled. Nobody's hunting anybody, That's already about as good as it gets, where I come from. That is not an answer to my question. He glanced at me, something almost like respect flickering across his expression at being caught. No, he admitted, it's not. He did not offer a fuller answer that night, and I did not push him for one, sensing, perhaps for the first time, that there were parts of him that were not simply guarded out of professional discretion, but genuinely difficult for him to put into words, the way certain experiences resist translation, even within a single language, let alone across the vast gulf between our two species. I spent that week continuing my quiet research into humanity, no longer out of professional obligation, but out of something closer to genuine fascination. I read historical summaries that described human civilizations rising and falling across their homeworld for tens of thousands of years, entire societies built and lost long before humans ever developed the technology to look up and wonder what existed beyond their own sky. I read about the sheer diversity of environments humans had learned to survive within, from the coldest regions of their world to the hottest, from the driest to the wettest, each requiring its own set of hard-won adaptations, its own accumulated knowledge passed down across countless generations. What struck me most, reading through all of it, was not any single dramatic fact, but the cumulative weight of an entire species that had never, not once in its recorded history, existed anywhere without something actively working against its survival. Every other founding species in the Accord that I had studied, including my own, had reached the stars from a position of relative safety, homeworlds that had, at some point in their development, settled into something resembling equilibrium, allowing civilization to flourish without constant existential pressure bearing down on it from every direction. Humanity had never been granted that equilibrium. They had built cities and philosophies and entire systems of law and art and science, while their own planet continued, patiently and indifferently, trying to end them, exactly as it had tried to end every living thing that had ever existed upon it, and they had never stopped. That was the detail that stayed with me longest. Not that humans had survived difficult circumstances, because many species had faced difficulty at some point in their history. It was that humanity's difficulty had never ended, had never been left behind, had simply been carried forward, generation after generation, until it became so completely woven into who they were, that a man like Ethan Cole could describe a violent incident in a diplomatic hole as not really dangerous, and mean it with complete sincerity, because somewhere in the deep, ancient architecture of what it meant to be human, that incident genuinely was not dangerous, not by the standard his species had been forced to measure danger against for the entirety of their existence. I began to understand something else too, something that unsettled me more than the survey report ever had. The other delegates on this station, the ones who had watched Ethan move that night in the dining hall and gone quiet with something like fear, were not wrong to feel unsettled. They had witnessed, without fully understanding it, a small glimpse of exactly what humanity was capable of when a genuine threat presented itself, and they had recognized, on some instinctive level, that they had no true frame of reference for what that meant, and that gap in understanding was, in its own way, more frightening than anything Ethan had actually done. I resolved to bring this understanding with me into the council session scheduled for the end of that week, a large multi-species gathering where representatives from across the Accord would discuss the future scope of the human exchange program. I told myself I was simply preparing to advocate more knowledgeably for a program I now understood far better than I had 2 weeks earlier. I did not yet know that the council session itself was about to become the moment everything I had learned would be confirmed, publicly and unmistakably, in front of every delegate present, and that the silence which followed would be unlike anything I had ever witnessed in a diplomatic setting before. The council chamber on Concord Station is the largest single room on the entire structure, built to accommodate delegates from every member species of the Accord at once, with seating arranged in a wide circle so that no single position could claim visual dominance over any other. I had sat in that chamber more times than I could count, and it had never once felt small to me until the day everything changed. Ethan stood at his usual post near the entrance, exactly where protocol placed him, along with the other bodyguards assigned to various delegates present that day. There were perhaps a dozen of them scattered around the chamber's edges, representing several different species, standing in the practiced stillness that all trained security personnel seemed to share, regardless of what world they came from. To anyone glancing around the room, he would have looked entirely unremarkable among them, just another quiet figure standing watch. I knew better now. The session itself began routinely enough, working through a lengthy agenda of trade agreements and border adjustments that required careful, patient negotiation. I contributed where necessary, my mind only half present, the rest of my attention drifting, as it had all week, toward the quiet man standing at the edge of the room. It was nearly 2 hours into the session when the topic finally turned to the human exchange program, and I felt myself straighten in my seat, some instinct telling me that this was the moment I had been preparing for, without fully realizing it. The delegate who raised the topic was a Talvex representative named Orin Vask, a senior member of a delegation that had never been especially warm toward the Accord's newer members. He spoke with the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing you already know everything worth knowing about a subject, and his tone, as he addressed the assembled council, carried an edge of dismissiveness that I recognized immediately, having heard variations of it many times before regarding humanity. I have reviewed the proposal to expand human security postings across additional Accord facilities, Orin said, his voice carrying easily across the wide chamber. And while I understand the enthusiasm some of my colleagues feel toward this newest member species, I confess I remain skeptical. Humanity is, by any reasonable measure, still a primitive civilization, barely a century removed from their own homeworld. I have seen the classification records myself. Their planet is rated as an extreme environmental hazard, is it not? Hardly the pedigree one looks for when selecting personnel to protect senior diplomatic staff. There was a murmur of agreement from several other delegates, and I felt a familiar flash of frustration rise in my chest, the same frustration I had felt myself only weeks earlier, before I had understood what that classification actually meant. With respect, I began, half rising from my seat, intending to correct the record. I believe the Talvex delegate may be underestimating precisely what that classification represents. But Orin was not finished, and he continued speaking over me with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the loudest voice in any room. Perhaps, he said, with a thin smile, the human delegation present today could clarify the matter for us. I am curious how their homeworld's hazard rating compares to other known Deathworld designations across the Accord's records. Surely if humanity wishes to be trusted with our security, we deserve an honest accounting of exactly what kind of danger they claim to have survived. I do not believe Orin expected anyone to actually answer him. I believe the question was rhetorical, meant to embarrass rather than inform, a small performance of superiority, delivered for the benefit of the watching council. Ethan answered him anyway. His voice, when it came, was calm and clear, carrying easily across the wide chamber, despite its quiet register, the kind of voice that did not need volume to command attention. I can answer that, if it would help, he said. Every head in the chamber turned toward him at once. Orin blinked, visibly caught off guard that a bodyguard, a role that on most worlds implied silence rather than participation, had chosen to speak at all in a formal council session. I was not aware bodyguards were permitted to address the council directly, Orin said, recovering quickly, his tone sharpening with irritation. They're not, usually, Ethan agreed evenly, but you ask a direct question about my homeworld, in front of the whole council, and nobody else in this room can actually answer it accurately. Seemed worth an exception. There was a long pause, and I watched the chamber's presiding officer, an elder Grovane official who had overseen council sessions for longer than I had been alive, consider the request with visible surprise, before offering a slow, permitting nod. Proceed, she said. Ethan stepped forward from his position at the wall, into the open center of the chamber's seating arc, and I felt my chest tighten with something that was not quite fear and not quite pride, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. The Talvex delegate is right, that Earth carries an extreme hazard classification, Ethan began, his tone level, almost conversational, entirely free of anger or defensiveness. That part of the record is accurate. What I don't think most of you understand is what that classification actually measures, because most of the Deathworlds on file in the Accord's records earned that rating from a single major threat, a hostile atmosphere, an unstable geology, one dominant apex predator species that outcompeted everything else. He paused, letting that settle across the room. Earth didn't earn its rating from one threat, he continued. It earned it from all of them, layered on top of each other, all at once, for the entire length of our species' existence. Weather patterns capable of destroying entire settlements with no warning, a disease environment so dense and so aggressive that our immune systems had to evolve defenses against threats most other species have never encountered even once. Predator populations that didn't just exist in isolated regions, but occupied nearly every environment our ancestors ever tried to live in, forcing every single human community across our entire history to build itself around constant, active vigilance, every single day, with no exceptions. His voice never rose, he never gestured for emphasis. He simply stated the facts, one after another, the way a person recites something they know so thoroughly that emotion has long since worn away from the telling of it. You asked how our rating compares to other known Deathworlds, he said, turning finally to look directly at Orin. Best answer I can give you is that most Deathworlds on record produced species that eventually left the planet and never looked back, because once they were gone, the danger was gone too. Earth's dangers are still there, still active, still trying, every single day, the same way they always have. We didn't escape our Deathworld, sir. We just figured out how to build spaceships while it was still trying to kill us. The chamber had gone completely, utterly silent. I looked around at the assembled delegates, and I saw, mirrored across a dozen different alien faces, the exact same expression I imagined I must have worn myself 2 weeks earlier, upon first opening that survey file alone in my quarters. A dawning, uncomfortable understanding, a recalculation happening in real time behind every set of eyes in that room. Orin Vask, for perhaps the first time in any council session I had ever witnessed him attend, did not have an immediate response. He opened his mouth once, as if to offer some rebuttal, and then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that felt adequate to the moment. Into that silence, the presiding Grovane official finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying easily across the still chamber. "Thank you," she said to Ethan, with what sounded like genuine, careful respect. That was illuminating. Ethan nodded once, a small, simple gesture, and stepped back to his position at the wall, resuming the same quiet stillness he always carried, as if he had not just single-handedly reshaped the understanding of every delegate in the room. I sat in my seat, my heart beating faster than I would have liked to admit, and I understood, with total clarity, that I had just watched something that would be discussed and repeated across this station, and likely across the entire Accord, for a very long time to come. The room had gone silent, exactly as I would later describe it, over and over, whenever anyone asked me about that day. But it was not the silence of fear, not exactly, though fear was certainly a part of it. It was the silence of an entire chamber full of experienced diplomats realizing, all at once, that everything they thought they understood about their newest member species had been, at best, dangerously incomplete. I glanced toward Ethan one more time before the session resumed its regular business, and found him watching me too, a small, tired, knowing look on his face, the look of someone who had delivered this particular truth many times before, to many different rooms, and had learned, long ago, exactly what kind of silence to expect afterward. I did not yet know how much more of that truth I still had left to learn. News of what had happened in the council chamber spread across Concord Station faster than anything I had witnessed in years. By the following morning, it seemed as though every delegate, every staff member, every passing trader in the station's commercial ring had heard some version of the story, each retelling slightly different from the last, though the core of it remained consistent. A human bodyguard had stood up in front of the full Accord Council and explained, calmly and without a single wasted word, exactly why his species should never be underestimated. I found myself receiving an unusual number of requests that day, other delegates seeking informal conversations with me, ostensibly about unrelated matters, though it became clear within the first few minutes of each conversation that what they truly wanted was to ask me about Ethan, and by extension, about humanity as a whole. I answered as honestly as I could, though I noticed, with some private amusement, that I had become something of an unofficial expert on the subject, almost by accident, simply by being the one Ithran on the station who had bothered to actually look closely at what had been standing beside her the entire time. I spent much of that day thinking back over the past 2 weeks, replaying small moments that I had barely noticed at the time, each one now taking on new and unsettling significance in light of everything I had learned. I remembered, early in our assignment together, watching Ethan eat his meals with a kind of quiet thoroughness that I had privately found slightly odd, never leaving anything behind, never wasting so much as a single portion, even when more food was readily available. I had assumed, at the time, that it was simply a personal habit, perhaps a matter of taste or discipline. I understood now that it was almost certainly something deeper, an instinct carried forward from a homeworld where food security had never, in the entirety of human history until relatively recently, been something that could be taken for granted. I remembered, too, a moment during our first week together when a minor medical emergency had occurred among the station's maintenance staff, a worker who had suffered a serious injury during a routine repair. Ethan had reached the scene before the station's own medical team and had begun applying emergency treatment with a calm, practiced competence that I had assumed, at the time, was simply part of his standard security training. I understood now that it was likely something more fundamental than training, a baseline familiarity with injury and survival that came from growing up on a world where serious harm was never a distant, theoretical possibility, but an ever-present feature of daily life that every human eventually learned to prepare for, in one way or another. Each of these small memories, taken individually, had seemed unremarkable at the time. Taken together, viewed through the new understanding I had gained, they formed a picture of a man, and by extension an entire species, whose relationship with danger, with survival, with the basic mechanics of staying alive, operated on a foundation entirely different from anything I had previously encountered in my career. I sought Ethan out that evening, not for any official purpose, but simply because I found that I wanted to speak with him again, now that I understood him a little better than I had before. I found him in the small station gymnasium reserved for security personnel, engaged in some kind of exercise routine that involved repetitive, controlled movements against a padded training surface, his focus total, his breathing steady and unhurried despite the clear physical exertion involved. He noticed me almost immediately, as he seemed to notice everything, and straightened from his stance with a small nod of greeting. "Ambassador," he said, "didn't expect to see you down here. I wanted to speak with you," I said, "away from official business, if that is agreeable." He gestured toward a bench along the wall, and we sat together in a silence that felt, for the first time since I had known him, comfortable rather than merely professional. "The council session," I said eventually. "I wanted to thank you for what you said." He shook his head slightly. "Wasn't really about thanks, Ambassador. Just seemed like the room needed accurate information instead of guesswork." "You have done this before," I said. It was not quite a question. "Explained your homeworld to a room full of people who did not understand it." He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, there was a weariness in his voice that I had not heard from him before, a tiredness that seemed to come from somewhere much older than his years. "More times than I'd like," he admitted. "It's a strange thing, being from a world that people either fear too much or don't take seriously enough. Never really lands in the middle. Some folks hear Deathworld and assume we must be some kind of savages, barely holding it together. Others hear it and decide we must be unstoppable, some kind of unbeatable warrior race, like it's something to brag about." He shook his head slowly. "Neither one's really true. We're just people, Ambassador. People who grew up somewhere that didn't cut us any slack. That's all it ever really was." I considered his words carefully. "But it has shaped you," I said, "in ways that go beyond simple upbringing. What I witnessed in that dining hall, and again in the council chamber, was not merely the product of difficult circumstances. It was something closer to instinct, something built into how your species processes danger itself. Maybe, he said. I won't pretend I fully understand the science of it either, but I think you're right that it's more than just how we were raised. Something about growing up the way humans grow up, it changes what your body and your mind consider worth panicking over. Most things that would send someone else into a full fear response, we've already sorted into the category of manageable, because manageable was the only option we ever had. Panic doesn't keep you alive on Earth, Ambassador. Clear thinking does. So somewhere along the way, we got very, very good at clear thinking, even when things get bad. And when things are not bad, I asked, when you are simply standing outside my door at night, with no threat anywhere in sight, does that instinct ever rest? He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything I asked him. Not completely, he admitted. I don't think it's built to rest completely, but I've found some peace with that, over time. It doesn't feel like a burden the way you might expect. It just feels like paying attention. Most days, on a station like this, paying attention doesn't cost me anything at all. It's just quiet. He glanced at me, something gentler in his expression than I had seen from him before. Being your bodyguard has actually been one of the easier postings I've had, if I'm honest. This station is about as safe a place as I've ever stood watch. I found that thought oddly comforting, and oddly humbling at the same time. That a man capable of what I had witnessed twice now, a man whose species had survived circumstances I could barely comprehend, found genuine ease in simply standing quietly outside my door each night. I misjudged your species, I said finally, the admission costing me more than I expected it to. When this assignment began, I viewed it as a formality, a courtesy extended to a young member of the Accord, more symbolic than substantive. I understand now how deeply mistaken that view was. Ethan offered a small, genuine smile, the first fully unguarded expression I had seen from him since we had met. Most people make that mistake at first, he said. We don't exactly announce ourselves. Doesn't really occur to most of us that we should. Where I'm from, everybody grew up the same way. It's not until we get out here, meet people who grew up somewhere gentler, that we start to understand how different it actually was. I sat with him a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier, more personal territory, and for the first time since this assignment had begun, I felt as though I was speaking not to a security officer performing an assigned duty, but to a person I was genuinely coming to understand, and, I realized with some surprise, to genuinely respect. I did not yet know that within days, that respect would be tested in a way far more serious than anything either of us had yet encountered aboard Concord Station, and that when the true danger finally arrived, I would witness firsthand exactly what it meant to stand beside someone whose homeworld had spent an entire existence teaching him not to be afraid of the wrong things. The alarm that woke me 4 nights later was not a drill. I knew it immediately, in some deep instinctive way that no amount of diplomatic training could explain. The same way I imagine every creature across every world can somehow tell the difference between a rehearsal and the real thing. The tone was wrong, sharper, more insistent, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, I could hear raised voices in the corridor outside my quarters, voices that carried an edge of genuine alarm rather than the practiced urgency of a scheduled exercise. My door opened before I had even fully risen from my bed, and Ethan was already there, fully alert, dressed, his expression calm but focused in a way I now recognized as entirely different from his usual watchfulness. This was not passive vigilance. This was something that had switched fully into motion. Station's underboarding attempt, he said, before I could ask. Unregistered vessel breached the outer docking ring about 6 minutes ago. Security's engaged, but we need to move you to a secure location now. I did not argue. I have been trained, as every senior diplomat is, to trust the judgment of assigned security personnel during an active incident, and something in Ethan's tone told me immediately that this was not a moment for questions. We moved quickly through the corridor, Ethan positioned slightly ahead of me, and to one side, his attention sweeping constantly across every junction and doorway we passed, and I found myself, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely grateful for the strange, unshakable stillness that seemed to live underneath everything he did. My own heart was pounding, my breath coming fast and shallow, the animal part of my mind screaming that something was deeply wrong. Beside me, Ethan moved like a man taking a slightly brisk walk to an appointment he did not want to be late for. We were perhaps halfway to the designated secure shelter when the first hostile group appeared ahead of us, emerging from a side corridor with the sudden, chaotic speed of people who had clearly not expected to encounter anyone in this particular hallway. There were 4 of them, wearing mismatched armor that marked them as some kind of independent raiding faction rather than any organized military force, the sort of opportunistic group that occasionally targeted stations like Concord during periods of heightened diplomatic activity, hoping to extract ransom or valuable hostages amid the confusion. I felt a surge of pure fear the moment I saw them, my entire body locking up with an instinct that offered no useful options beyond simple, helpless terror. Ethan did not hesitate, and this time, having spent the last weeks learning exactly what that absence of hesitation meant, I understood it differently than I would have a month earlier. It was not recklessness, it was not aggression for its own sake, it was simply the complete and total absence of that fraction of a second most beings spend deciding whether a threat is real, replaced instead by a mind that had already, somewhere in its deepest architecture, decided long ago exactly what to do when danger presented itself. He moved me behind him with one steady arm, positioning his own body between me and the approaching group, and addressed them in a voice that carried none of the panic I felt radiating through my own chest. "Station security is already responding," he said, calm and clear. "This corridor's a dead end for you. Turn back now, and nobody here has to get hurt." One of the raiders laughed, raising his weapon with the casual confidence of someone who believed the odds clearly favored his group, 4 against what appeared to be a single unarmed bodyguard protecting an unarmed diplomat. What happened next occurred faster than I could properly follow, and slower, somehow, than any single second should have felt. Ethan moved with the same terrible fluid economy I had witnessed once before in the dining hall, each motion connected seamlessly to the next with no wasted effort, no unnecessary force, simply the minimum required action to neutralize each threat in turn, before the next one had fully registered what was happening to the one before them. Within moments, all 4 raiders were disarmed and subdued, none of them seriously harmed. The entire confrontation ended almost before I had fully processed that it had begun. Ethan checked each of them briefly, confirming they posed no further immediate threat, then turned back to me, his breathing barely elevated, his expression carrying the same mild, focused calm he had shown throughout the entire encounter. "You all right?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in the question, directed entirely at me, as though the confrontation itself had already been filed away as a completed, unremarkable task. "I am fine," I managed, my voice shakier than I would have liked. "You are certain they are not?" "They'll be fine," he said. "Security will collect them shortly. We need to keep moving." We continued on, and over the following 20 minutes, as station security worked to fully contain the boarding attempt, I witnessed several more moments that, had I experienced them a month earlier, without the understanding I had since gained, would have left me convinced I was standing beside something almost incomprehensible. Other human personnel stationed aboard Concorde, I learned later, had responded to the crisis with the same eerie, focused calm, moving through the chaos with an efficiency that left the station's own trained security forces visibly startled by comparison. By the time the all-clear finally sounded, the intruding vessel had been fully secured, its crew detained without serious incident, and the station's own emergency response teams were already beginning the process of restoring normal operations. I sat in the secure shelter where Ethan had eventually brought me, my hands still faintly trembling from the adrenaline that had not yet fully left my system, watching him complete a brief communication with station security through his comm device, his tone as level and unhurried as it had been throughout the entire crisis. When he finally turned back to me, something in his expression softened slightly, some small acknowledgement of what we had both just been through. "It's over," he said. "You're safe." That was... I struggled to find the right word, my mind still racing to process everything I had witnessed. That was considerably more serious than the incident in the dining hall. "A little," he agreed. "Still not the worst night I've had." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside me, some final piece of understanding settling fully into place. I had spent weeks learning, intellectually, exactly what it meant that Ethan Cole came from a Deathworld. I had read the survey reports, listened to his careful explanations, watched him calmly reshape an entire council chamber's understanding of humanity in the span of a few measured sentences. But it was only now, sitting in the aftermath of genuine danger, watching him process what had just happened with the same quiet, unhurried calm he brought to everything, that I finally understood, on a level deeper than mere knowledge, exactly what that meant for the people who stood beside him. It meant safety, not the fragile, theoretical safety of well-maintained systems and careful protocols, though those mattered too. It meant the deeper, more absolute safety of standing beside someone who had already decided, long before this night, long before he had ever left his homeworld, exactly what he would do when danger finally arrived, and who carried that decision with him everywhere he went, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to be asked. I did not fully understand, not yet, everything that decision had cost him, or the species that had shaped him into someone capable of making it so completely, so instinctively. That understanding would come later, in a quieter conversation, once the adrenaline had faded, and the station had returned to its usual gentle rhythms. But sitting there in that secure shelter, watching Ethan calmly report the incident to Station Command, as though he were describing nothing more dramatic than a delayed shipment, I understood, with total clarity, exactly why the entire council chamber had gone silent days earlier, and exactly what kind of species the galaxy had truly welcomed into its ranks. 3 days after the boarding attempt, once the station had fully returned to its normal rhythms and the formal reports had all been filed, I found myself once again walking the long observation corridor with Ethan beside me, the stars sliding slowly past the reinforced glass, exactly as they had on so many quiet evenings before. Something about that particular walk felt different this time, though I could not immediately say what. "I have a question for you," I said, breaking the comfortable silence between us, "and I would like an honest answer, not the careful, measured version you tend to give the council." He glanced at me, a small, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough. Are you ever afraid of anything?" I asked. "I have watched you face down armed intruders without so much as a change in your breathing. I have read the survey describing the world that raised you, and I confess I still do not fully understand how any person could move through such an existence without carrying fear as a constant companion. So I ask you plainly, is there anything in this galaxy that frightens you?" I expected him to deflect the question, the way he had deflected similar questions in our earlier conversations, offering some careful, measured non-answer designed to keep the true depths of himself politely out of reach. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the slow turn of stars beyond the glass, and when he finally answered, his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness, replaced by something quieter, more honest, more human than I had yet heard from him. "Yeah," he said, "there's plenty that scares me. Just not the things people usually expect." "Tell me," I said gently. "It's never really been about the danger itself," he said slowly, as though working through the thought for the first time even as he spoke it aloud. "Not the storms, not the animals, not people with weapons in dark corridors. Growing up the way I did, you learn to make peace with those things pretty early, because there's no other option. What actually scares me is losing people I care about, watching someone I love face something I can't get to in time to help. That's the fear that never really goes away, no matter how calm I look standing in a hallway with 4 armed strangers in front of me." He paused, and I saw something pass across his face, a shadow of some memory he did not fully share with me, though I did not ask him to elaborate, sensing that this quiet honesty was already a gift he did not offer easily. "Back home," he continued, "everybody loses somebody, eventually. That's just part of growing up there. You learn to be strong against the world trying to hurt you, but you never really learn to be strong against losing the people who make that world worth surviving in the first place. I don't think anyone ever really does, no matter where they're from." I stood with him in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had shared, understanding, perhaps for the first time completely, that everything I had witnessed over the past weeks, the calm, the stillness, the terrifying absence of hesitation, none of it meant that Ethan Cole was without fear entirely. It simply meant that his fear had been shaped by an entire lifetime on an unforgiving world into something narrower and deeper than the broad, diffuse anxiety I might have expected. He was not fearless. He had simply learned, out of pure necessity, exactly which fears were worth carrying, and had set the rest of them down long ago, somewhere back on the world that had demanded that discipline of him from the very beginning of his life. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for telling me that." He nodded, and we continued our walk in comfortable silence for a while longer, until he spoke again, his voice returning to its familiar, easy calm. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think the Accord's about to learn something important, having humanity around. We're not here to be anybody's weapon, Ambassador, whatever some folks might assume after watching me in that dining hall. We're just people who grew up somewhere hard, trying to build something better, out here among everybody else. That's really all it's ever been." I thought about his words often in the weeks that followed, as reports of that council session and the boarding attempt spread further across the Accord, carried through official channels and informal conversation alike, reshaping, delegate by delegate, world by world, the galaxy's understanding of exactly what kind of species it had welcomed into its ranks. I do not think the galaxy fully grasped, not yet, everything that understanding would eventually mean. Humanity had not arrived among the stars as conquerors, nor as the primitive, uncertain newcomers many had initially assumed them to be. They had arrived instead as something far more difficult to categorize, an entire species shaped by hundreds of thousands of years spent surviving a world that had never once offered them mercy, carrying that hard-won resilience with quiet, unassuming grace into every room they entered, every crisis they faced, every gentle evening walk down a peaceful observation corridor. I think of that first night often, the shouting, the raised weapon, the 3 seconds that changed everything I thought I understood about the man standing quietly at my side. I think of the silence that followed him through that council chamber, and the deeper, more complete silence I felt inside myself the night I finally understood what that silence truly meant. The galaxy had not simply gained a new ally when humanity joined the Accord. It had gained a species that had already survived its own extinction, over and over, across an unbroken chain of hundreds of thousands of years, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, emerged from all of it, not hardened into cruelty, but tempered into something quieter, steadier, and far more remarkable than cruelty could ever have produced. I do not know what the coming years will bring, as humanity continues its slow, careful integration into the wider community of the stars. But I know this much for certain: whatever challenges lie ahead for the Accord, whatever dangers this vast, unpredictable galaxy still holds in store for all of us, I no longer worry, not truly, about facing them with someone like Ethan Cole, standing quietly beside me. Because I understand now, in a way I never could have before that first shouting voice broke the silence of a diplomatic dinner weeks ago, exactly what it means to stand beside someone from a death world. It means, more than anything else, that you are no longer standing alone.